Okay, everyone, welcome back. Welcome to part two of our coverage of China. And we're picking up exactly where we left off from before. Mao Zedong dies in 1976, and he is succeeded by one of the most important leaders probably the most important leader in China's modern history, Deng Xiaoping, who I would have to say just not only breaks from pre-existing Maoist ideology, but sets the country on the path that it is today as an economic power. And I have to preface by saying that I cannot discount Nixon's secret visit to China in the early 1970s as not a catalyst of this. My guess is that the conversations that Nixon had with China was that the United States would effectively turn a blind eye to China's retention of single-party communism, single-party authoritarianism, in return for the country opening its economy. And it seems like this was a deal that Mao was more than happy to make because it assured the stability of the country, but it also brought in external investment and much-needed diplomatic recognition. Not only that, but as communist as China was, its relationship with the Soviet Union was rocky at best. The fact that the country was adamantly opposed to just being another satellite of the Soviet Union was certainly problematic. And in the larger conflict of Vietnam, right? We now know that the biggest instigator of conflict in Vietnam was not the Soviet Union. It did not come from Moscow, but it came from China. So my guess also is that Nixon's visit to China is that the United States finally realized who was really pulling the strings in Vietnam, who was really giving Ho Chi Minh all the weapons, supplies, and safe havens. And my guess is that that visit kind of acknowledged that the United States would begin to pull out of Vietnam. It's a losing fight. It's a losing battle. But in return, China would gravitate towards some form of market capital development. If we couldn't get Vietnam, we could certainly get China's cooperation. And you know what? If that hypothesis proves to be true, Nixon is far more shrewd and far more important than history remembers him for. But, regardless, we can talk about that whenever I teach American foreign policy. But for now, back to the show here with China. The point here, at least as far as this class, is that Deng Xiaoping, as I said, was a radical break from existing Maoist ideology. And, once it became known that the after effects of the Cultural Revolution were actually more damaging to the state's security and sovereignty than the Great Leap Forward, it was necessary to dramatically reduce ideological dogma. So we're going to go back to just kind of this, have it your own way, do it yourself, paint by numbers type of communism, which really became at this point, rudimentary proto-corporatism. But alongside this, all right, I've been mentioning, China emerges very, very, very nascently onto the international market to the point where you jump, 20 years until Deng's death in 1997, and China is a major exporting power. And if all of this can be done while retaining a single-party state apparatus and retaining the monopolization of power by the CPC, I would say it was a cost that they could easily afford. Right? It was a strategy that certainly paid off. Right? So, what are we talking about here? What are some of the things that transforms China into an economic power? The first thing I want to say is that this does not transform China into an economic anything overnight. Okay? Just please understand that, from Mao's death in 76 throughout the 80s and even the 90s, right, China is still a very weak, very agricultural, very rural, very impoverished state. It does not hold a candle to Japan. And even by the late 1980s, when South Korea begins to start flexing its own economic muscles, China is still, I wouldn't even say in third place, because Taiwan is economically superior to mainland by this point. So China is at best in maybe fourth or fifth place in that sense. So China's got a long way to go before it becomes the big, corporation that it is today. But two things under Deng start the whole process: the household responsibility system and the township and village enterprises. The household responsibility system is the closest that China ever gets to private property. Right? So technically speaking, right, the land is still owned by the state. Right? There is no private property per se in China. But the land is now rented out to individual families, right, which is kind of like the equivalent of, tenant land holdings. But rather than just being a tenant in an apartment, you've got a tenant, in a farming area. And that land is yours, right? That land is yours to do, whatever you want, right? You want to farm on it? Great. Guess what? Whatever you farm on it is yours. And whatever you can't eat, you can sell at market. You want to put a big backyard swimming pool in your backyard? You go ahead and do that. You want to have absolutely nothing in your backyard? You go ahead. But you are paying the state either a monthly fee or an annual fee, whatever it happens to be, right? But the state lets out the land. It's the closest that China gets to private property. And for the most part, if you are in the countryside, right, you're going to use that land to grow your own crops, farm your own food, or maybe even raise your own livestock in that sense. Now, the other thing that goes hand in hand with this, and this is the thing that really succeeded, the Township and Village Enterprise, the TVEs for short. TVEs is the closest that China gets to economic decentralization and local self-management. So in other words, while the country is still operating within an economic regulatory framework, it provides the equivalent of economic autonomy to villages and communes to figure out what is best for their own economic planning and prosperity. So, with household responsibility systems, right, if you, let's say, grow a surplus amount of food, and rather than throwing it out, you can sell it at the market, and that's your money. If the town allows for, let's say, a farmer's market or, local shops, local commerce, okay, suddenly we see the beginnings of a rudimentary civil society. And of course, that money can also go towards schools, hospitals, institutions, and other public services. Now, the TVEs, in the grand scheme of things, right, because I want to move this discussion forward here, proved to be enormously successful under Deng, right, throughout the 80s. Again, nothing to make it globally competitive, but it was responsible for almost 40% of China's total industrial output, making it one of China's most successful initiatives. Okay? And, when we think about this in the larger sense, right, Deng's philosophy was very much, sort of a hands-off approach, right? Deng's philosophy, more than anything else, was this concept of economic freedom gives you political control, right? That's the whole thing. If we give the public some form of economic freedom, loyalty is automatically assumed, right? You're not going to question the state. People riot when there's no food. People riot when there's famine. People cooperate when there's a farmer's market. People cooperate when your income increases. And make no mistake about this, the TVEs, over a period of 10 to 15 years, right, not only puts money into the pockets of an emerging nascent Chinese middle class, but it quadruples the standard of living. So, from a real hardcore Machiavellian perspective here, you're not going to bite the hand that puts money into your pocket. You're not going to rail against the system that is suddenly making life better for you. And, if Deng's whole thing was it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse, right? Then he's kind of saying, look, the ends will justify the means. And at the end of the day, what is the end? The end is prosperity for the country, stability for the country, a quality of life for the people. And whether we use Karl Marx or Adam Smith or David Ricardo or, maybe a little bit of, or better yet, Adam Smith with Karl Marx, then why not? The only thing is that the cat, black, white, tabby, calico, tuxedo, whatever, shaved, not shaved, the cat has to be a card-carrying member of the CPC. Like, that's just it, okay? So you just pick a cat, and, think of a cat, any cat, he's got to have the little, hat on with the little red star. That's it. Other than that, Bob's your uncle, okay? And that may help explain why the public has been rather cooperative with the government since then, right? The only time that there was some visible form of protest was the Tienanmen Square demonstrations of May, June 1989. Interestingly enough, these demonstrations happen before the big demonstrations in Eastern Europe. Like 1989 was the make or break year for communism. And you, as a communist government, were going to either not live out that year or you were going to ride it out. You were going to ride it out, but you needed to make some serious concessions. The student protests, as you know, ended up in failure. And I think it was largely because the protests never really were more than just that, students, right? Especially, let's say, urban to the equivalent of middle to upper middle class students. So it never really got the support of the working class, the peasantry, the farmers, the rural areas. Unfortunately, right, the demonstrations kind of made international news, and this was kind of an embarrassment for the Chinese officials. So, the National Guard is sent in, the movement is crushed. You might even remember, and I'll put this up probably in the lecture, but you remember that iconic photo of this one guy standing in the middle of the street with a bunch of shopping bags, and he's literally blocking a row of tanks from coming down the street, right? So probably one of the most iconic images of people power and raging against the machine is attached to the one movement where the machine won over, literally won against the rage. But the crackdown of June 4th, 1989, once again served as a reminder that the state will give you certain degrees of freedoms, but please do not mistake this as state weakness. The state can giveth, and the state can take it away. Now, after Tiananmen, and I would even say after the collapse of a number of single-party communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe later on that year, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, East Germany, and then a few years later, the whole Soviet Union, right? China realizes, okay, we dodged a bullet, but we better give some significant concessions. And the concessions is that in return for continued monopolization of power, economic liberalization is only going to intensify more. Okay? So in return for political control, we will once again relinquish some control over the economy, over industry, and give the people more purchasing power, give the people more abilities to make money at the local level. And, throughout the 90s, this raised the debate about whether an expanding economy can meet social, demands without politics. In other words, can an expanding economy kind of make the public happy without having to resort to electoral democracy? And, about a decade or so later, the answer was a resounding yes. China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001. And there is no improvement in political rights or civil liberties. But after Mao's death, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. After Deng's death in 1997, he is succeeded by a number of party secretaries that are far more technocratic than ideologues. So Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, both still alive today, continue the legacy of Deng and govern the country less like old school Cold War party secretaries and more like CEOs, right? So, Deng is like the last generation of those pre-war communists that, still show up to meetings wearing, the old, the dark blue, solid colored Mao jacket, kind of like, it's like a very peasant looking like garb. Since Jiang Zemin, it's black tie, suit and, shirt and, polished shoes, to the point where today, right, the leaders of China, especially the current party secretary, Xi Jinping, we're going to get to him in a moment, they act more as CEOs. They act as chairmen of the board in that sense. So, China, it kind of continues to evolve while still retaining the old business model that exists, I think, more so in symbolism than anything else, right? China today is, its official name is the People's Republic of China. I think more appropriately, it should just be called China Incorporated because of its expanding middle class that, has little to no adherence to Marxism, Leninism, communism, and any of that kind of stuff. And the idea that there is an expanding number of consumer societies within China. And if you don't believe me, right, Chinese citizens, mainland Chinese citizens, are one of the biggest buyers of high-end real estate around the world. So when you see another one of those super, luxurious apartment buildings that are going up in New York, there's a good chance that some of the most choice materials are going to be purchased by Chinese Communist Party officials, usually to give their kids or whatever it is, right? So that building across the street from us, right next to Junior's? Well, it's not a building yet, but it's a big gaping hole. And if you kind of know what's going to be there, we're going to get like this Burj Khalifa that's going to be, you'll be able to see this thing in the far distance. I guarantee you I'll be able to see this thing on the train going to New Jersey. It's going to be like 100 and some odd stories tall. I guarantee you, the penthouse suites are going. There's going to be at least one or two Chinese businessmen that is going to own that property. Okay, so it kind of tells you that in return for compliance and just loyalty, increasing numbers of the Chinese population can continue to just engage in market economics to the point where the official portrait of Mao, which still stands in Tienanmen Square. Like if we were to just kind of expand and zoom out, it's kind of like this is a perfect amalgamation of what China is today, because the country is run more on money and finance than on anything smattering of old school Marxist philosophy. And just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here, right? Look here at this top part here, right? General economic and financial indicators of China. This is 2000 to 2009. Look at the GDP growth for each year. Look at this. China's real GDP growth, China's economy grew by more than 8% in 2000. 8.3 in 2001, 9.1 in 2002, 10%. China's economy grew 10% in 2003. 11, almost 12% in 06, 13% in 07, 9% in 08. Oh, look, recession. 8% again in 2009. Here, let's continue this on here. Okay, in 2010, got a little bit above 12. Now, it's been sort of in a downhill for the last decade. Folks, let me tell you what this all means. If any of you have ever taken a class in economics, okay, one of the basic things to know about GDP growth is that if a country's GDP per capita increases by 2%, the country is healthy. If the economy increases by 3 or 4%, they are doing phenomenally well. When you look at the indicators of China, where it's 8.4, 9.1, 10.4, 11.6, 13%. Folks, this is capitalism on crack. Okay? It's just like, when you look at these numbers, I mean, this is just, and every year is sustained growth. So 2019 doesn't look like much in comparison, right? But what's the lowest number here? 6%. If the Chinese economy still grows by 6%, that outpaces everything in the West. That outpaces the US. That outpaces Japan. That outpaces Russia, Germany, anything else like that. So yeah, the Chinese economy has certainly taken a beating since the 2008 economic crisis. And I would venture to guess it's going to take another beating, once we get the numbers from coronavirus. But if the numbers are still 4%, even 3%, the Chinese economy, just by economic indicators, is doing phenomenally well. Phenomenally well. And that leads us to looking at China in the present. Okay? Since 2012, China has been governed, ruled, probably managed, by one of the most powerful people in the world today, Xi Jinping. Okay? Now, who is this guy? What's his game? What's his whole purpose? Because he's in the news all the time. And he is quite possibly the only person who gets more attention and more deference than Vladimir Putin. Right? A few years ago, Vladimir Putin was one of the most powerful people on the planet. Today, that honor, if it's going to a politician, goes to Xi Jinping. Right? So who is this guy? Well, he emerges as China's party secretary in 2012. Okay? So we're talking about an era of economic monopoly. Okay? Chinese economy is growing by 10%. Okay? Growing by 10%. So in this case, he inherits a country that is already at the opposite end of, Deng Xiaoping's opening up. So Deng starts the process and Xi picks it up as China is regarded as one of the most economically important countries in the world. So he gets a car that already is, well driven and is already regarded as one of the fastest on the road. So what he has to do is just simply manage this thing. Now, you might think to yourself, he's done kind of a poor job managing it. Not necessarily. Because what he's done is he comes in 2012 at a period of, at another turning point period. Okay? China's economic growth has created a significant amount of party members that are corrupt, inept, the same type of oligarchs that Putin has to deal with in that sense. It's also important to note here, folks, that you can make as much money as you want in China, but you have to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's like joining a union. It's joining a guild. It's joining some kind of organization that, allows you, you got to pay your dues every year, this, that, the other thing. But Xi promises some type of internal party reform seeking to eliminate corruption and bureaucratic ineptitude. So, it's at this period where we might be thinking, China has been doing good, but they're due for another internal audit. Right? They're due for some kind of public unrest. Right? It's been a while. It's been about 30 years, right? So Xi's whole idea is to kind of play the sovereign democracy card. The same thing that we talked about with Russia last week. But rather than building a structure up from scratch like Russia, Xi's whole thing is that the building is sound, but it needs renovation, right? So we're going to almost gut the internal features of the house, We're going to pull out all of the wiring. We're going to knock down some walls, maybe even eliminate a floor here or there, right? But the outer structure is going to remain, but it's internal renovation, right? New floors, new wiring, new electricity, an updated security system, certainly a working AC, all sorts of stuff. But what, of course, when you gut a building, when you gut, elements of the state, you are engaging in an internal party purge, right? And there are people that, this is not North Korea, so you're not lined up and shot, but you're forced into retirement. You are kind of, encouraged to, take maybe a mid-level position somewhere away from the capital or whatever it is. And you make direct overturns to the people, right? Just like Putin does. You kind of bypass second and third level management, and you just kind of speak to the people, the ordinary people, by saying, look, we all know that this country is corrupt. We all know that there are, that the people who run the country can sometimes be inept, and, more than unqualified for their job. So support me, and I'm going to root out all of this corruption and all of this, average mid-level management. And this has actually created in China, interestingly enough, the equivalent of a popular cult of personality. Right? Now, we don't see this as much as we see it in Russia because everybody likes to make fun of, pictures of Putin on a horseback without any shirt on. Try not to picture Xi Jinping on a horse without any shirt on, but, there is this marketing gimmick within China as well that has elevated him for reasons that confuse a lot of people in the West as someone who has not accumulated this much power and authority since Mao Zedong. And what also makes Xi Jinping interesting is that his two predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, right, they're both still alive. But they were definitely seen as, let's say, rotating party secretaries, who after a certain amount of time were encouraged to retire as well. Xi, on the other hand, now has an internal following that is willing to make him party secretary for life. And he is, in his upper 50s, lower 60s? So he could basically run China for the next 15, 20, 25 years. And because there's no elections in China, there's no multi-party elections. There's inter-party elections. You can vote for the Communist Party, the Communist Party, the Communist Party. But as long as he is seen as this, technocrat, in a sense, Chinese authoritarianism will continue to attract support both inside and outside. And I want to finish up on this in the remaining, 10 minutes that we have here. Look, we've gone through this very quick crash course of Chinese politics. And, we haven't even gone through the integral mechanisms of how politics works. It's not important for this class. The point is that the CPC has withstood a number of periods in which lesser competent parties would have collapsed. Today, there is very little voice in the international community that is calling for democratic transition in China. And when it is, it oftentimes is shushed away to page 5 or 6. There's some kind of attraction with Chinese authoritarianism because, especially under Xi, this is bureaucratic authoritarianism, right? And it is non-charismatic, non-ideological, but more than anything else, is based on this concept of stability, or more specifically, a word that we make up in poli-sci, stabilitocracy, right? China is kind of branding itself as a stabilitocracy. And what exactly is that? A stabilitocracy is a country that considers stability, order, and law to be paramount, right? We're in an age where economic volatility is rampant, right? Uncertainty is certainly the key here, and China is considered to be probably the two biggest of all too big things to fail. So Xi kind of models himself as saying, look, guys, I'm the party secretary. It's going to keep this thing going, keep this business going, keep the ship from sinking, keep the school from shutting down. And you know what? If we're the second largest economy in the world, that's acceptable to many states, Democratic or otherwise. And please don't think that if we get rid of Donald Trump and replace him with somebody else, Biden or whoever, that we're going to be insisting on China democratize. We don't care. Okay, Obama didn't care. Bush the younger didn't care. Bill Clinton didn't care. And Joe Biden, on the off chance that he gets elected, he won't care either. Okay? And I think another reason for this is that China's emergence onto the world as a major power is probably speaking one of the least confrontational, as long as you're not in East Asia. Right? Chinese foreign policy is really driven by two things. One, are you willing to do business with us? But two, what's your take on Taiwan? You know? Like, this is the one thing that will make or break Chinese foreign policy. Do you recognize Taiwan as an independent state? Oh, you do? Oh, sorry. Well, we can't do business with you. We can't bail out your companies. We can't build a power dam. We can't put a highway. We can't really, extract your oil. We can't really do any of that kind of stuff if you're going to be belligerent towards us. Now, if you change your attitude about Taiwan, give us a call. And I guarantee you, within like a month, the country will rescind recognition of Taiwan. Right now, Taiwan, I think, is recognized by 25 countries. That's it. At one point, it was about 85. Now it's down to about 25. The United States does not recognize Taiwan. I think the most important country that recognizes Taiwan today, the biggest and most powerful country, is Honduras or something like that, right? Now, the rest of the world does maintain economic relations with Taiwan, but Taiwan has no UN representation, and they have no hope of being recognized as an internationally sovereign state. That's fine, as long as China is considered. As long as you don't recognize it as a country, then we're okay with that. And if that's already on the books, we can do business with you. And we don't even have any strings attached, like you need to democratize more, or you need to, clean up your human rights. China doesn't give a damn what you do, as long as you either A, have money to buy their stuff, or B, have resources with which the Chinese can buy, right? So they don't really care. Business is business, right? You're going to, punk minorities, or you're going to, persecute one group of people over the other. Hey, look, that's your business, not mine. I'm not going to tell you how to run your affairs. If you want a moral lesson, talk to the United States. But, they're really the last people that you should listen to. And I think one of the final things that makes China so important for the world is that they are the fail-safe for North Korea. We can talk about, we can and we should talk about North Korea in our next Zoom chat, especially in relation to China, because China keeps North Korea on a leash. China keeps North Korea from doing anything stupid. And here's the thing. China is really no big friend of North Korea. They can't stand North Korea. They are tired of having to be North Korea's babysitter. But North Korea relies on China as its most important outlet to the rest of the world. And I would even venture to say that if there was a possibility of the North Korean government collapsing, China has a contingency plan in which it would invade and occupy North Korea, simply to prevent the United States or the South Koreans from doing so. And Russia would be right along with them. So China is important because China kind of keeps North Korea muzzled a little bit. Pyongyang will listen to Beijing. And that kind of helps us to understand Beijing's increasing importance in East Asian affairs. So the big picture, right? The big picture with China, right? This unapologetically authoritarian state that is one of the most important economic powers in the world today. The CPC has a resiliency most likely due to its pervasiveness more than its ideology. So to answer one of the questions that we started out with in part one, how has the CPC survived as opposed to any other major communist party? Simple. The CPC got rid of ideology when they buried Mao. Right? As far as the CPC is concerned at this point, it's little more than a bureaucratic corporation. It has at least 70 million official members. Now, how many of them are party members? Not many. But if you want to be anything in the country, you have to join the party. And that is anything from economic entrepreneurs to middle class to whatever. It is just simply a way of maintaining the omnipotence of the CPC as the way forward. And if the CPC endures as just simply saying, hey, join our party, pay your dues, and then do whatever you want, sure. There's a great way of explaining why it survives. It has proven itself to be significantly flexible under Deng, as opposed to many other communist movements and governments under the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe that refused to reform. And guess what? The public rises up against you and out you go. Okay? But look, not only that, the expanding economy under Deng is going to do a really good job of eliminating threats of dissension, right? So, you're not going to rise up against, again, as I said, you're not going to rise up against the government that is literally putting money in your pocket, right? That is giving you the ability to not only rent, but buy penthouse apartments in London and New York. And, China does get along quite well with its other neighbors, right? Russia, it works with. India, it works with. The big question is which country is going to emerge as the bigger power, India or China? Right now, China looks like it's got the upper hand, but India could probably handle an economic recession better than China. See, the one thing we haven't noticed with China, one thing we have not noticed with China is that the good times have been rolling year after year. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how authoritative the country is going to be if recession hits. So there's something to think about there, especially when economic growth comes at an expense to at least half the population. The rural countryside is abandoned and exploited. Rapid industrialization has led to environmental destruction, as I mentioned. And of course, an expansion of the middle class puts an additional strain on global resources, right? Not just fuel for cars, but oil, both, cooking oil, fuel oil, palm oil, for whatever reason, exotic ingredients that involve the decimation of entire species of animals is a big thing in China. And, as long as the economy is doing well, and as long as the Chinese economy is helping others to do well, the world will actually overlook China's lack of political liberalization. In fact, almost deem it unnecessary because market capitalism, in the absence of liberal democracy, seems to function as a new model for global modernization. And China is, as I said, doing a really good job of showing the developing world, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Central Asia, guys, you can totally embrace market capitalism without having to be a liberal Democrat. And, it's all good. And this may be something that Xi is going to be able to exploit because right now, here we are sitting in quarantine, and we're all kind of waiting for China to finish making more masks and ventilators. And if Xi is able to market himself as somebody who can save the world, hey, we provided the coronavirus and we'll provide the cure for coronavirus, they're going to continue. They're going to continue to be a major, major country. So China's place in the world, the Great Wall Syndrome seems to still be playing, right? What makes the CPC also very important is that it keeps foreign interference out. China works with the world, but on its terms, not on the world's terms. As far as communism is concerned, the ideology was lost decades ago. I would say even before Mao had died. In many cases, communism just simply functions as a Neo-Confucian model of order, respect, and logic, very much falling into the philosophies of stabilitocracy. The question of whether China needs the U.S. or does the U.S. need China, that's another debate we can talk about online, we can talk about in the discussion forums, but it's clear that the two operate in a symbiotic relationship. I think both need each other. China could kill the U.S. economy in one day just by calling in its debt. Right? If China ever enters into a recession, They could call in America's debt and bankrupt the entire country. And the only saving grace is that America would say, if I'm going bankrupt and I'm collapsing economically, I'm taking you with me. So there's a reason why the two are not really at each other's throats. But again, this East Asian model of development, as I've been saying, might be something that could be used for Vietnam, for a post-Kim North Korea, for a good number of African dictatorships, as well as Central Asia as well. So there's a lot for us to digest, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can certainly talk about in our next Zoom chat, which I really appreciated last week's. But don't wait for that. If you are now at the end of this lecture, okay, go on to the discussion forums, post your thoughts. Post your questions. Send some stuff to me as well. Be active. Let me know that I'm, reaching out to you. Be active and let me know that you're reading the material, and you should be able to really, really do well in this week. All right, so that's it for now. I will see you online next week. We begin wrapping up all of the material for this class. So we've still got a conclusion to do, and that's important because you've got to get all of this stuff in before we get to the final readings. All right, I'll see you in a bit. Take care.